we're going to look at some more advanced shader options now. And we're going to stick with this plant, but it's getting a little boring just working with one. So what I want to do is save it out as a new species. And we're going to take a look at that hooking point. And now since I'm saving a new species, the hooking point will possibly not be remembered. So let's take a look really quick on how to fix that. It'll also be covered a little bit later, a little more in depth. What I'm going to do is just basically modify the name. I'll just call it leaf top 1. I'm going to change the scale to 0.35, click OK, create a new plant, edit the material, 0.34, set it back, click OK, grow a new plant. Now I should be able to save it and it should remember the hooking point. So we can select up at the top, Save Plant Species. And now I'm going to save this out. I'm just going to call this ASLFX Rubber Plant. And we can keep maybe the main title. I'll just make sure that I know I modified it. Now, if I was to change the name of this, modify it, one thing I always suggest you do whenever you create any sort of modified plant, any sort of new species, is that you make a note of what species it came from. Now, in this case, the rubber plant was made from a different species, which we can see noted here. So whether or not you want to note both of them, but since it came directly from the rubber plant, I am going to type in base species and a rubber plant. This way, if anything happens to the file, or you run into any issues transferring the species between systems, then you can easily take those maps or any sort of materials and kind of update that original species and not have to worry about figuring out which one it was originally that you were working with. Now in this case it's pretty easy because it's still the same name for the most part. But in case you were really creating some extreme modifications, now really in this case I just kind of updated the textures, made them look a little bit better. So it's really not that big of a deal, but if something completely different, you wouldn't really know what the species was, you might not remember. It's a good idea just to make a note. Now, incorporate texture maps, whether or not you want to save those with your plant. Typically, whenever I create a new species, I do like to incorporate texture maps. It does make it a little bit easier to load them in and not have to worry about dependent files. But if you're working on one project where you're just creating plants for that project, if everything's in the same directory, you shouldn't have to incorporate the texture maps. And that way you can easily modify it a little bit more, save some space. What I'm going to do in this is just incorporate them, even though we might end up swapping them out. So there we go. We can start with that. I'm going to hide this from the render just for now. We can just click on a little preview. And then I'm also going to go up to the top to the aspect tab, and we have this lower button where we can choose preview mode. We could set it to wireframe. It's a good way to see how many polygons there are generating the leaf. A good way to analyze plants. But I'm going to select hidden. And now what we can do is I have, if I just zoom out a bit, what I did was create kind of a pedestal to put these plants on. While I'm editing them, I could modify the material of this surface. It's a little bumpy, just something I created, and it's kind of a neat technique if you're not aware you can do this. I'm not sure I've covered it in quite some time in any of the recent training, so I'll just show you this really quick because it's a really neat feature. A lot of people actually don't know about it, so we'll go ahead and just do this. Now what I did was I created a cylinder, and what I want to do is just change the scale. And because the last preview mode I selected was the wireframe, it did create the new preview as a wireframe. I'm going to change this to smooth shaded. We can position this. The material is going to be the material that I had on the other object. So I am going to reset it. Just right click, reset, and we can edit the material. By default, any reset material would be called material. I'm going to call this material underscore mod, just for modification, just to give it a different name. Now what I want to do is modify the bump. So we can right click, edit function, or control click to open the function editor. And this doesn't need to be anything really complex. So what I'm going to use is a noise node up here at the top, or you can right click, add in a noise node, and then you can choose what you want. Now the default is a Perlin noise value. I'm changing this to gradient. I want something a little smoother. A value noise creates some very sharp lines. We can modify the scale and then connect it to our bump. And now we're going to turn on displacement mapping. Click OK. And what we can do is right click on the object and bake it to polygons. And choose kind of a middle ground, a mid amount. Click OK. And what it's going to do is bake the displacement onto the object. And this way we can create shapes from displacements. Now in this case it does look like there was a little bit of tearing along the top. So I'm going to undo, make sure we're on world standard. We'll go ahead and select displace outward only, reevaluate the material. We could force the extension outward if we needed. I'm going to go back, edit this function, and maybe scale it up a little higher. Actually, I'll go ahead and scale this down slightly lower. We'll give that a try. And increase the depth to, let's say, 2. And then we can bake it to polygons again. And it does look like there's a little bit of tearing on top, but it shouldn't be too bad. It doesn't look like it's actually showing in the render, so that should be okay. It is slightly, might need to reconstruct the surface. You can right click, go to edit object. You can choose to decimate, or you can increase the smoothing amount. Let's just decimate this slightly, see if that fixes it. Sometimes it'll really just depend on the values you're using to create the original displacement. I was able to get a pretty good one earlier. The edges sometimes can get a little funky, especially with an object like this, a cylinder. If you have access to another application, I would suggest basically 4-point polygons. The reason most of that tearing is showing up is because the cylinder uses 3-point polygons, a central point, and if we take a look at the sphere, which now has the material of the leaf on it, and we'll use that. Basically, it has a central point on the top of the cylinder, and actually, we will go ahead. It's going to be a little difficult to tell. We'll reset the material. Okay. It has a central point at the top polygon that we can see here. And you can see the polygon surface. If we switch this view mode over to wireframe, we'll see that a little bit better. And then from that point, it connects to all the outward points. So what's happening is there's not really enough geometry on the top of the cylinder in order to really create the depth needed, and that is causing the tearing. So it's really based on just the object itself. What can work the best is a cube. You can modify a cube. That tends to work okay. Since we're displacing it, now I did end up using a box. I was able to get it to turn out pretty good. So let's go ahead, or sorry, I was using a cylinder and it turned out all right. Let's go ahead and use a box and see how that turns out. And a cube will normally subdivide the best. So we'll go in here, back to that material, set our depth to 3, set up that function once again, gradient, reduce our scale slightly, click OK, and bake to polygons, which it does not look like it is letting me do at the moment, because I probably did not turn on displacement mapping, and that is why. Okay, so we'll go ahead and turn that on, set some of these options. You can also turn up the quality boost, which is going to increase the resolution of the mesh and smooth things out a little bit better. So now we can see that displacement. There's some smoothing errors. So there's another thing we can do. I'm going to go ahead and undo. Increase that quality boost a little bit more. When we bake, we can go a little bit beyond the 50% mark. And then we're going to smooth it. Do a slight decimation. Click OK. And that works a little bit better for the top. So I just thought that was a cool technique. The sphere works well too, but it has the same problem with the top being 3-point polys. So if you have another application, what I would suggest doing is taking a cube or box and subdividing it kind of like a metaform to smooth out the edges, and then import that and use that to create your displacement. So what I want to do is use this bottom pedestal. I'm going to take my material from the infinite plane, the ground, which is a grass I modified from one of the grass presets to make it look a little more realistic. And then we can select plant stand, paste the material, and we'll rename it so it's not also called grass. We don't want any confusion between the materials. And our scale is set to 100. I'm going to turn on ecosystem, and as you can see, the scale has been reset, so we do need to turn that back up to 100. So now we can go to our ecosystem layer, go to general, and add in plant. Now, since I don't have the collection loaded in of this plant, what we can do is just load in the species. So down here we can browse for the file. And now we can see the rubber plant, the modified one. We can open that up. And I'm just going to populate this as it is. Go to the density, turn off decay near foreign objects, and if we take a look at the environment tab, we do need to make sure that these settings are going to work for this. So what I'm going to do is just increase the altitude range all the way up to 1, increase slope range to full, remove any fuzziness options, populate, and now we're not going to have that sort of an influence. So we could adjust the scale if we need to. We'll make it a little bit denser. Increase our sampling quality. Sampling quality will conform closer to the options we have set to control density. It's going to give you a much more accurate amount. It's kind of a quality boost in a way for the sampling quality. And I do have show objects in full detail. I'm just going to go ahead and set it to smooth shaded, so I don't even need to use the full quality near camera. And we can just see all of these plants in here. And I just want to make sure that everything looks okay, and it does look like the hooking point is showing up correctly. So what I can do is go in and take that other rubber plant and delete it. Now, what I also want to show you is that we have the ecosystem population. So anytime we want to modify this plant, what we can do is going to our center, which is the library, we can select the plant, double click on it, and it's going to open up the editor. So we can make modifications, adjust the flexibility, curl amounts, which for the rubber plant was set really high. Keep in mind that going over a value of 100 does tend to cause some issues sometimes, not always. And even with the default plants that come with, will have these options. But I have seen that frequently a lot of plants tend to modify flexibility and curl and set them to either a value of 0 or negative 100 or negative 200, depending on the max amount of the slider, or setting them both to 100 automatically, and it does cause some issues with the plant. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes. So once we make modifications, we can click Save, and it'll automatically update our ecosystem object, creating sort of a temporary file. And we also, in this case, have, and it doesn't look like it is showing right now, you do have the ability to use a master object. So you could edit this in master edition mode, which in other words will create that plant in the scene that you can modify as an object. So if you're not previewing everything in full quality, you can at least preview that instance, edit it, and then it'll update. So I am going to just make sure that this is going to update correctly. And we can select the ecosystem material, repopulate, and we can see it has changed slightly. Now I do want to change the size variation and kind of level these out a little bit more, make them a little closer. So setting it to 0 is no size variation on anything at all. So you're really just keeping with the solid growth size. And then you could do a non-uniform amount. This will stretch just the Z and the Y. All zeros is going to set it back the same. So it is kind of an overall scale, but also keep in mind that the biggest impact you're going to see is on the Z. So now we'll click OK, and now we can take a look at some of these other modes. I am going to adjust my camera. And we can still see the pivot. Now we're working with something a little more open. And that should be good. Around a nice little cluster there. And we might need to just turn that up because with the orbital camera, the way the pitch works is a little bit different. And that's only if you're using Camera Orbiter from Snowflake. So now we can see something a little more interesting, having several species of plants in here. And we can see that node showing up, some of those leaf edges, blending. But I also want to take a look and show you how else we could use that. It doesn't have to be based on slope or even the top or bottom of a leaf. So if we go into the material, we can see we can edit our ecosystem material, which is the material we were working on earlier. Now, rather than connecting this to slope, let's pick something else. We're going to right-click, add in an input node, and change it to angle of incidence. And now let's go ahead and connect our control to the angle of incidence. It's going to prepare the ecosystem, and it's going to modify and update that color. And it's modifying the material and not regenerating the population. I may need to repopulate or just modify that amount to get it to show up. So let's go to ecosystem, repopulate, and it does look like it's just the material intensity isn't enough. So we'll go back and just our input. What we want to do is select and add a filter. There's a couple of different things we could do here. Let's start with the brightness and contrast. And if we take a look at our preview, this is really going to be the best way to see what's going on, which is our final output. So now if we take a look around the edge, this is what's going to be happening to our leaves based on the angle. So by adjusting contrast, we can adjust that threshold amount and how soft we want it between using both these different nodes, or both these controls. So let's just increase it a little and see if we can get that to look a little better. And just doing a quick preview here. So now we have what we can see, just this preview render, that now, based on the angle of incidence or around the edges of our leaves, depending on the curvature and the position in relation to the camera, we start to get that blend to that new material. Now we don't necessarily have to do this with color. We could do it also with the bump. And there's some other techniques I'm also going to show you. But first we're going to just create another modification of this and edit the function. We're going to change that perspective color to more of a yellow and a nice bright yellow-green. And this will update the ecosystem. And we can just move around the scene. And now we'll start to see it getting brighter on the edges, which is going to create more of a natural look. And this will also allow you to pull out a little bit more of the bump and adjust the backlight a little bit more. You can also adjust and control backlight with that angle of incidence. And highlight also becomes another important factor. Now, I do notice what I was referring to earlier about the way the bump maps can reverse. Because our bump is now connected to the angle of incidence, but really what I'm seeing shouldn't affect it. And if we take a look at the leaf on the right here, we can see that the stem is going in, and over here on the left, the stem is coming out. And that is the kind of reversal you can see on some of the plants. And in this one, it does start to kind of come out in the top, dip in, and that does tend to happen a little bit with this material. They do switch. We are going to look at that more in depth in just a little bit, just because it is difficult to tell. And it doesn't always happen with every plant. It really depends on the lighting situation. So I want to show you a very advanced shading option. It can take a little longer to render, depending on how it's used, but it can be very beneficial for creating very realistic plants. What I want to do is get rid of this rubber plant. It is not exactly one of the best ones to start out with. So we're going to go to the material, and we are going to remove the rubber plant. We're going to add in one of my tropical plants, from the Tropical Plant Collection. If you do not own the Xyle Effects Tropical Plant Collection, what you can load in that will be really close to getting at least the sort of overall brightness and color is if you go into your grasses and plants. The closest thing is really going to be the excellent species. You can use that, and that we can get some of the tones and hues. But this will pretty much apply to any leaf. I just want to use something that has a nice high resolution map, and something I know looks good, but can of course be improved. So let's take a look just with the default settings without adding any extra options. There are some highlight maps that I use for this collection and pretty much all of my other plants I've created. Let's go ahead and render this out a little better quality. Increase the sunlight amount. And I'm going to change this. Let's just render it to screen. Look a little bit better. Okay, so now we can see these plants, and you can see the different highlight amounts. Might need to maybe increase the radiosity amount a little bit to lighten up the backs of the leaves, or adjust the sun. Auto exposure can really play around with lighting a little bit too much sometimes. And I've just created a little bit of a higher res render, and I've got the sun almost directly in front of the camera, although it is pitched higher in the sky, just to get a little more backlight. I believe it is slightly to the left, but you can just see the image a little bit better and what we're working with to begin with. So going back to backlight, the backlight by itself, it can be fine-tuned, extracted into a function connected to, let's say, angle of incidence, things like that. But there are some controls you really don't have, and without having to make too many modifications to specular values, there's another fairly high quality trick to create another type of backlight. And what we're going to start with is, if we go into transparency, we're going to change it to an additive. Now, I'm going to go ahead and leave this as an additive before making any other changes, just so you can see what happens without making the next couple of changes. And we create a very interesting leaf, some nice glowing materials, and this can actually be a neat way to create some translucent surfaces. You can get a really dreamy kind of glow around everything. Might be useful for some translucent underwater species, but this isn't exactly what we're going for here. I just wanted to kind of show what possibilities you have with this. Keep in mind too that the atmosphere, as we can see, because it is an additive in the scene, right now we can see that fine line where the horizon is. One thing to keep in mind when you're using that, I'll just show you, tilt it up a little bit with a green background, because it is going to add that extra bit of color. So if you have anything behind it, it will really show up that way. But one thing you'll start to see is the highlights showing up around the plants. And I'm going to go ahead and render this just so you can see it with a little higher quality, because we are starting to pull out the highlights that we need. But what we need to do is just fill back in that plant, because we obviously don't want this sort of a surface. But looking at the indirect lighting right now as it's rendering, you can see around the edges and where things start to kind of stack up and really kind of fold over, you're getting more of a kind of a Fresnel effect, which has to deal with transparency. Basically, the Fresnel effect, if you're not aware or familiar with it, let's take a glass or any sort of wine glass or anything like that. And around the edges, there's a bit of thickness to the glass and the surface itself. Well, as that builds up, the surface itself becomes less transparent and it stacks up. And in older rendering systems, those kind of effects and shaders weren't available. It's been around for quite a while, really built into systems, and it can be easily done within Vue and other applications. It's been in a lot of programs for quite some time. It also has a bit of reflection that can build up as part of that density around the edges, and then it all kind of works into the sort of Fresnel look, which is basically just having sort of that pre-thickness around the edges and making to a point where the transparency goes away, reflections can increase, highlight amounts change, and that comes from Fresnel, who created the first, it was a lighthouse light, and the lens he created, the Fresnel lens, and that's where that comes from, is that sort of refraction, and that's where the name comes from, the Fresnel effect. So you can see that coming up in a lot of different programs and referred to frequently. So that way you know what it is. So I'll just go ahead and let this finish rendering out, and just kind of stop rambling about that and let that finish. So looking at a little higher quality of a render, you can see it is really interesting. However, it does have a few problems. Obviously the interaction with the atmosphere, but also the fact that doing this removes the shadows if we keep it in this mode. But this is not how we're going to be using it. I just wanted to kind of show you. So what we want to do is go back to our leaf, and in order to get back the color we need to go to the Effects tab, and under Color Transmitted Light, turn it up to 100%. This is going to possibly make the diffusion too high. So I am going to just take our diffusion and bring it down to 45. And doing this is really not going to impact the plant a whole lot just yet, because there's a few other options that really tie into it. So I'm just going to do a quick render. Just with this setting, you can see the difference. It's mostly a brightness of the leaves, creating sort of a fake radiosity and a more interesting backlight. And I did just notice that the shadows, I believe, are turned off. And that does tend to happen when turning on the additive. You can see Cast Shadows is now turned off. So we'll turn that back on. And that might have been with the additive as well, the same thing happening. I'm going to create another render, but first I want to just reduce the amount of plants we're looking at so I can increase render speed on my end. And also so we can zoom into a plant, but still have a few others, and start to see the effects we're going to be creating. Now, this is only a final quality render, which is why the grass is starting to look like crap and really grainy. In broadcast mode, it does look like some nice distant grass. That material is also included. I modified it. It looks like good distant grass, pretty realistic, reacts very nicely with light. If we take a look at what's kind of happening with the leaves now, we have a different sort of backlight going on. And what we're seeing is more of the specular highlight channel kind of coming through in the backs of the leaves. And there's a tiny bit of transparency with that as well. Now we're going to go beyond this and modify the specular values, but not directly with the highlight mode. If we go back to transparency, in order to trigger this to work, we need to use refraction. Because we now technically have a surface that's not only using the transparency map to cut out the edges, but the leaf itself is becoming transparent. If we increase the refraction index to a higher amount, now since most of nature is mostly made of water, we might as well use a refraction index of water, since plants will be primarily that. Although we might have to keep in mind other factors, since leaves, sugars, things like that. But we'll just start with water. Not really too concerned about that amount. We also have a new value, which is turn reflective with angle, that becomes available when refraction is on. Which, also going back to the Fresnel effect, and Fresnel being the creator of the first lens for a lighthouse, or most effective one that we still use today anyway, we have, with refraction, more doubling up in the sides. That's also also apparent within the subsurface scattering that's part of translucency, where there's also the refraction index. Kind of work the same way. This turn reflective with angle will increase a little bit of render time, depending on the species. And without making any other changes, let's just go ahead and click OK and see how it's going to look just starting with those settings at their defaults, because editing the span and intensity is going to allow a lot more control. So just using, just directly having the refraction turned on, we start to see these nice highlights around the edges and curves of the leaves. This is a reflection, and there are other ways to achieve this, but reflection is really going to create the most realistic look. Now, we have different ways of modifying this specular value, and that is controlled. If you open up the material, still within the transparency tab, we have flare option. The flare option deals with transparency. Typically when you're viewing something from below it, it is the diffusion and the contrast of the reflected surface, or the glow of the transparency with the light. So it works in different ways depending on what kind of surface you're using. With leaves, it's sort of going to be a highlight amount and a highlight size, but overall it's going to be fairly shiny. So increasing the intensity is going to really brighten up the effect, and then the span is going to be the fall off amount, kind of the diffusion overall on the surface. So let's just increase both of these up a little higher, 64 for the intensity, 60 for the span. It's going to update the ecosystem, and now we're going to see a really, really intense effect. and I'm just going to point up a little more towards the sun. It will affect, in this case, the backlight a little bit more. But you'll still be able to see that on top, and we can switch over to that side. So I'm going to do a small render with radiosity, but using this option also allows us to turn off radiosity and get a very similar look and effect. So we will be switching this over to either the standard or global ambient mode, and then we won't have to re-render or render a pre-pass. So now you can see it spread out a lot more on the surface. And really, this kind of an effect is very difficult to achieve with just using the highlights and specular channels directly, because it doesn't really take into account the thickness of the leaves. And this is sort of a way to fake subsurface scattering and also radiosity with it. So there are, of course, some adjustments that need to be made because it is a little too bright in some of the areas. But first, we don't really need to use radiosity when we're working on this. It certainly looks better, and almost always will. But if we render it now with global ambience, we'll be able to see a very similar effect, although it might not be lit as much in the back. You can definitely get away with not needing radiosity. And a really nice thing about that is there is an option to ignore indirect lighting on plants, which ignores all of the GI passes. So any sort of indirect lighting pre-pass that's tied to global illumination, radiosity, you can ignore just on plants but have the rest of the scene use radiosity. In this way, you'll be able to still generate a plant that looks realistic and reacts correctly with the lighting. Although if it's closer to other objects, you might need to maybe use an ambient occlusion mode with it, maybe separate passes, but for the most part, you really won't need to use radiosity to create a nice looking plant. So I am going to turn down the overall intensity. Go back into the material, turn down our intensity to, let's say, 40%. There's another thing we can do, and this is color reflected light. And then it is bracketed in metallic. This will darken the overall leaf and essentially remove that highlight. So it's a good way to tone it down if needed. And the nice thing, in our preview, we do have an update of the surface and all those materials as we're working with this. So if you need to, you can increase your preview. You might need to increase the quality. We'll use standard mode. But that way we can get a good idea, really just kind of paying attention to the highlights. Now another thing I'm going to do is change the highlight color. In this case, actually, what I want to do is extract the highlight color and attach it to the leaf. And if we take a look, this is our the highlight map that is working on the surface, the bump map, and the transparency. So the highlight really has it glowing or much brighter around some of the more surface details. Change our preview options, zoom in, see that a little better. Although I do have a little more control by increasing the overall brightness, I could also take this filter and create a new key point. Just click, new key point. Just going to view the grid. and we can drag up that left side, which is going to take the smallest amount, or whatever is the lowest amount of highlight, and increase it. So that way we have no minimal highlighting. Now this map is really modified to work well with this plant. So I'm going to increase the span, and we can adjust the turn reflective with angle amount too, which will also adjust the edge highlighting. So we're starting to see something a little bit different showing up. Let's go ahead and render this a little larger. And now you can really see an almost glass-like surface on these leaves. So I would not recommend it for a very large ecosystem of this shader, just because the render times are greater. If we take a look, this took 2 minutes to render, which really isn't all that bad. But it is possible to render much quicker. And this is also in the final mode. Broadcast would probably take about 6 minutes. And I'm using a quad-core processor at 3.2 gigahertz per core. So we're using an 8-core system. Probably get something a little bit faster. But we're also only rendering a couple of plants. So if you have a huge ecosystem full of these, you're going to run into some huge render times that might not be necessary, because when you're farther away from the plants, it really may not show up well enough to be worth it. So this is something for high detailed close-ups. You can really get a lot from the plants this way. When you're looking at them close-up, you get these nice glassy surfaces. And you can also connect, let's say, the intensity setting to maybe the angle of incidence, and that will create a really nice look. You may need to invert it, but let's take a look at the span. And I'm going to increase it up to 150. And it looks like maybe that's not really dispersing it as much as I'd like. Turn up our turn reflective with angle, and also keeping in mind that the refraction index is going to make a big change. I'm going to turn the refraction index up to 2 and click OK. We'll take a look at the effect, and what we're seeing is a huge increase in the overall glow and overall what would be quote-unquote backlight now that it is beyond the backlight setting. So you can just tell by this coloration. I'll do something a little smaller because we're going to make another change. We'll just do about the same size as the preview, but a higher quality mode. I also want to note that even though view is 64-bit and I'm running in 64-bit, the preview render uses 1 core. So if you're working on a multi-core system, rendering is often faster than relying on the preview and waiting for it to update. Preview is just kind of there for a quick reference, color, kind of while you're working. For the most part, rendering a preview is rendering just an actual frame. The size of a preview is going to be much faster and look better. So it'll definitely give you a much better idea. So if you can see this overall glow, that's really kind of small. I'll increase the scale just so you can see that amount. Of course, it is a lower quality render. But what I want to do is show you how the backlight option has changed. If we go to Effects and Modify Backlight, let's go ahead and turn it off down to 0. Click OK. Let that update. What we're going to see is a little bit of a change in the way the color looks. We see a lot more of that reflection and less of the color shining through. So this time, do something a little bit larger. And now they're pretty much almost a full glow and shininess of the color. We lost a little bit of the depth by turning it off, but that does give you a little more control. You can extract the backlight, add in the angle of incidence input node, and I did add the wrong one, so I can just change it. And if we take a look right now with angle of incidence, it is set where the edges are darker and the center is brighter. I want to reverse that. Add in a filter in the connection. We can set it to opposite. And then we'll run another filter and use brightness and contrast. Increase our brightness, increase our contrast. So I've got 0.85 for brightness and a little over 2.06 for contrast. So this way we can still have backlight, but now it's going to be intense around the edges of our leaves, and then in the centers, or really it depends on the angle, it'll darken up a little. So we can end up with a very nice looking plant. So one of the best ways to modify this further, to get it to look a little more realistic, is to possibly increase the turn reflective with angle and then decrease that intensity amount. So I would go into the transparency. We could turn reflective with angle up a little and decrease our intensity, and then take a look at the preview, and now we're going to see a little flatter of tone. Go to effects, turn up the metallic amount and the color reflected light, and that's going to bring a little bit more back into the plant, but give us a little more of the color that we're working with. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now the only thing that really is standing out a lot is basically the stem. Because we're no longer using the radiosity lighting and we're just relying on direct light, the ambient light amount for the stems is it's too dark, and it's not glowing like the rest of the plant. It doesn't look as nice. So what we can do is modify, I guess we'll start with what would be the trunk. And there's a couple of things we could do. If we are not moving out of the ambient mode, we're not going to use global illumination or radiosity, then we can use the luminous amount. Keeping in mind that the more we increase this amount, the lighter our shadows will also get. But it is a quick and easy way to brighten that up. Another would be to increase the ambient, and we're really not seeing a huge effect. So we could also turn on backlight for our stems, and we're going to start to see them lighten up a little bit. Maybe I'll go ahead and decrease that. We'll bring it down to 70%, which I also believe is our shadow density. And then I can adjust the stem doing the same, bringing that up to 70. And now it won't be that black that was showing up earlier. If it needs to be adjusted further, there are other ways to get it increased. You can increase the diffusion, which will brighten it up. But for the most part, it should be alright. Even looking now, I can start to see some of the areas are lit up a little bit better, and not as dark as they were before. We don't have that intense glow, so we might want to even set up the same sort of material for the stem that we have on the leaf, that same shading effect. It might not be necessary though. But for the most part, looking at this, typically I wouldn't be able to tell that this was a global ambient render. Although we might need to maybe decrease backlight amount or the intensity of some of that glow, maybe increasing the metallic setting to darken it up a little bit. So let's go ahead and take a look coming from the top, because we haven't really looked at some of the direct light on these plants. So I do want to see how the sunlight looks. So let's get in front of the shadow a bit. We'll go slightly to the side, and then we'll be able to really see how that's going to look from the front. Because it is going to change, because we're not going to have some of those backlight settings. Because the backlight is really something that only shows when you're behind the lights in the scene. So when you're viewing from the front, you may need to use global illumination or modify some of the settings a little bit further to get it to react correctly along that line, and that could be part of the refraction, mainly in this case. Overall, I think it looks pretty good. We do have a lot of stacking of the shadows on some of those areas. So it could be a matter of adjusting ambient light settings, just the overall lighting balance of the scene itself. But like I said, this is really more something for close-ups, not something you'd want to do large scale, but it does open up some of the possibilities for using view for photorealistic plants for close-ups and not just distant ecosystem plants. It's really just a matter of just kind of fine-tuning the lighting and making certain modifications. There's one other thing, and this can greatly impact the way the highlight looks. Go ahead and increase our highlights. We can go between the isotropic and the anisotropic lighting. I typically like the anisotropic lighting. I think it creates a better highlight for a lot of the leaf surfaces. And also, the grass that I have, and the grass material, is using an anisotropic lighting amount where I have it more towards that side, and it creates a little more realistic of a highlight value. So these do take a little longer to render like this, but it does end up being worth it if you can afford to render them. Before I was saying that other frame was only 2 minutes, but I also have that quality boost turned down. This is not a solution for animation. Quality boost should not be set to negative 1.5 for animation, just because the sampling of the indirect lighting would just not be a high enough quality, and you'll get a lot of flickering. So not exactly a setting for animation.